Welcome. In this video, we'll show you how to use Foundry to install HAPI on your local machine, publishers sharing resources, and curators managing metadata. We'll walk through real demos and answer key questions from the community. Let's get started.
So moving down the line here to the third perspective, 3 of 5, is more of an implementer. And so an implementer would typically be a developer or other highly technical person that is directly responsible, like hands-on keyboard level, for implementing a specification at their site. So as hands-on as you can get. And if you're in this category, you typically are going to want to run things locally. So while an executive or subject matter expert may be content to just going to Foundry, hitting the try it now button under a product listing, kind of clicking around a little bit, and in 5 minutes just saying, okay, I think I get the gist of it, that I think I'm done. That's not how a developer works. Developers really need to get into the coding weeds, make changes, try to figure out what needs to be customized, develop estimates on how long this IG is going to take to run locally, identify any gaps. They're going to have to go back to Foundry to get the links to how to see how to provide feedback to the actual implementation guide. So this part has a live demo associated with it. I already talked about the Aegis portion. This is not currently live, but within the next couple months, most likely, you're going to start seeing some badges provided by Aegis Touchstone with some sort of quantifiable metric here. I don't know how it's going to work exactly, but by having this badge here, that's one initial objective measure of how complete this specific piece of software is in relation to the actual specification. It is typically, or I think it's always the case, I think it's safe to say, that none of the reference implementations are going to be 100% perfect. But you wouldn't know that just by looking at them. And so if you click on these badges in the future, you'll be able to access the actual reports from Aegis Touchstone and then see the areas that were determined by their test suite to be compliant, as well as the areas that aren't, and even get into some of the reasons for it. And further beyond that is kind of a separate conversation. All right, so let's get more into this development use case then. Because I want to start doing some of this hands-on stuff about halfway done. All right, so running a basic FHIR server. So when you're getting started with Foundry, as a developer or a technical user, the most common question is like, so how do I actually get started? And for that reason, we've provided a couple type of getting started type resources. HAPI, just from the way that the market determined it, tends to be the reference implementation, FHIR, or not reference implementation, the kind of a de facto FHIR backend for R4 RIs. And so I think almost all the RIs that are published to Foundry so far rely on some form of HAPI, or in some cases, embedding HAPI into their own server, making tweaks to HAPI itself, and then publishing that as an RI. Foundry has 2 configurations of HAPI that are available for those that don't need to change anything. One is R4, which we expect almost everybody to use, and there's also an R5 configuration of it as well. If you have a project that is using resources that need to use R5 or something in R4B, you may want to look. We're not supporting R4B in the HAPI configuration to date. We might want to do that though if people need that. So that is available. And then after you're running HAPI locally, on top of an actual database, and not just in memory, but an actual persistent database, having some capability to load your own data bundles into it, and you're using that as your first 10 minutes, hopefully, of getting into the FHIR development ecosystem, especially if you're an established engineer, but you're not familiar with FHIR. FHIR as a specification itself is a pretty high learning curve. It's not something you're just going to read in an hour and understand. So the ability to actually get a running stack onto a developer's machine quickly is really core, especially as they're trying to do the exercises of how to initially engage with a server. So to show that, I'm actually going to jump out of the slides here for a couple minutes, and I'm going to go to the Foundry production site. I'm going to search for HAPI here. HAPI is going to show up as a core piece of infrastructure I'm not going to go into a lot of demos here or details here. There's a brief set of instructions, and we do have a larger guide that I can share if people are interested. There's an additional tab here called Configuration Wizard to select the specific runtime configuration that you want to use. There's an R4 version here, which I'm going to use. And I'd mentioned there's an abstract concept of a runtime platform. If you want to try this at home and you don't have that, you can go up to your account tab here, click register, and this will, you can name it whatever you want. We'll just call this demo. And now when you go back to, when I go back to HAPI, you will have that platform registration here in this list. It's really just a container, like a logical container for any software that you want to run. I'm going to go ahead and add this R4 configuration to my test environment here. And now once that's done, I missed the link. You can click on that little view button in the pop-up, or if you missed that like I did, you can go up to my environments at the top, and I'm going to see that I have two services here that have been pre-configured and added so that I can run these in my own local environment. You do need either Docker desktop running, which is what most of our community tends to prefer. If you have Podman desktop, that is also suitable. And developers that are familiar with Kubernetes can also use that as well. For demo purposes, most people seem to prefer Docker, which is a third-party piece of software that is standards oriented. I'm going to go ahead and download this configuration file by clicking this big button here. And at this point, I now have, I can run a single command on my local machine. And what that's going to do, it's going to take a few minutes to spin up. But what it's going to do is it's going to download the images of both HAPI/FHIR and Postgres server. Once those as they start up, it's going to configure each of those so that they integrate together. So it's provided HAPI/FHIR without having to click anything, with a bunch of runtime parameters that you would have to go and look up on HAPI/FHIR's site. In some of the cases, it's not even documented particularly well. So you would probably spend a couple hours just trying to figure out like how to actually start HAPI, and especially how to wire that into your own Postgres database, which is a lot more powerful. And so now, a couple minutes later, I believe that's fully started up. Now that it's booted, I can actually follow the instructions and see it running on my local machine all within a couple minutes. Now, I'm not going to dwell on that because we have a lot of time, but we could actually start making FHIR queries at this point. Look to the slide. And this general pattern applies now as a basis for the way that all software distribution through Foundry works. And once we have this set of core common services, we also have MySQL, Redis as database, a number of others. MongoDB is another one of those. We're in the process of adding Wildfire to the system, which is an extremely compliant and also open source licensed FHIR server in collaboration with Aegis, as well as doing their Aegis Touchstone integration for testing purposes. And so soon it will not just be HAPI/FHIR. We also have Spark, which is a former product of Firely in the system as well, and are working with them to make that more usable. We talked about HAPI. I showed this in practice. And so now we're going to move a little further down the line to the 4 of 5 perspective of a publisher. What I'm considering a publisher is someone that's in the business of actually either developing a reference implementation that we want people to actually try out and use, or a developer of a generalized and probably much more complex FHIR solution that we want to publish into the catalog for our executives and subject matter experts, but also for our implementers to use and to integrate in context of other third-party systems, be them additional FHIR backends or other client applications on top of ours. So to introduce this, I want to take that same basic FHIR server example that I just showed, and I'm going to make it a lot more complicated because someone developing an application in practice isn't going to have a simple feature architecture like this. They're going to have something that maybe looks like this. So this is Dr. Adela Grando. I work with her. She's a real person at Arizona State University. I work with her on a weekly basis on an unrelated grant program. And one of the primary artifacts of this NIH grant is a CDS service and that operates on R5 resources. And so this is like very bleeding edge, and it's intended to work on R6. So it's very, future forward because it's for grants, not for production use. It does use HAPI under the covers, and it requires HAPI to be in its Postgres database mode underneath that. In addition to the CDS hook service, there are 3 user client web applications that have to be deployed on top of it. So to simply run this is not a 5-minute exercise anymore, because you have to set up your own Postgres database, you have to set up your HAPI server, then you have to set up the CDS hook service. And once you have that running, there's like an entire rules processing management app that you have to set up. And then once that's, or excuse me, the provider management app, then you have to set up this rules management system for the CDS hook service to use. And then on top of that, then you have like this patient portal, which uses a combination of the below 3 things to actually provide an interface to patients. So, I mean, this is more like what you would see in the real world, right? It's not just a FHIR server with a single application on top of it. It's a set of integrated things which are not cleanly separated. The patient portal app, in this case, it needs to use the CDS hook service, but it also needs to make queries to the FHIR service underneath that. And then surrounding the whole thing, there's probably authentication and authorization as well. And to answer the question from Michael Fawn, the answer is yes, that it's wiring up a compose file, and it will provide more complex files in the future. There's just some technical stuff we're getting through. All right. So today, the way you would do this, or so Dr. Grando would have to do this, is really just set up, her own sandbox environment where people can go and kind of click through stuff publicly. And then if you want to actually get this running locally, she would point you to her GitHub repositories, and there'd probably be 12 things there, and you kind of have to sift through each of those at the project level and figure out, what do I need to run? How do I run that? Where's the sample data that goes with it? I'm on a Mac machine that uses an ARM chip. Can I even run these on my computer? What are the licenses? So it's very complicated to distribute this. And as an implementer, this is like your first week of trying to understand what's going on with her releases, because it isn't really clean to do that. And at some point, something's going to be not documented right. There's going to be a README file that's 2 or 3 years out of date or missing completely, and it's going to be a very frustrating process to try to even evaluate it, let alone adopt it locally. So we're going to try to fix that, and I'm also going to throw in one more slide here to talk about the product lifecycle. So from Dr. Grando's point of view, while she wants everything to be published locally, she wants people to have the latest builds, but she also wants to engage in feedback cycles. So it's great if she has stable builds, and maybe she's releasing once every 2 or 3 months. That's awesome. But even though she's not developing an IG, she wants to take advantage of the feedback mechanisms that are in Foundry, and she wants like the community aspect of it. So when people are finding things, they're saying, hey, maybe someone in the work group or the security work group says, hey, consent in C6 or R6 isn't going to work like this. You probably need to rethink the way you're doing this. She wants to engage in all of that to make her own work products better. So to facilitate that, there is a life cycle that's associated not just with every product within Foundry, but every build of every product as well. And it's going to start with submission. And here at the top, there's a public form that looks just like this. And the purpose of this form within Foundry, I think it's under the developer menu now, is really just to kind of get the human aspect started between the curation team of Foundry and you as the publisher of a FHIR asset. Some are very simple and may not even have a running piece of software. They might be just like a piece of computable content only. Some, like in this use case, are very complicated. So that submission form gets it started. Once that curation back and forth happens, which does take a little bit of time, and the reason for that is we're trying to pre-coordinate as many gaps as possible so that when people actually view the product in a runnable form in Foundry, by that time, it's fleshed out enough that any common questions of getting started are already answered. So they're provided in that listing, and that when they download them, They work as they're just supposed to work, and there's not any major surprises. So to reach that vision, though, we have to front load some of that work between the curation team and you as the publisher to make sure that you're packaging things correctly. If there's some sort of like database connection string or URL that the user has to be able to set, well, they have to be able to set that in the first place. So you may have to make a few tweaks to the way that you're actually configuring your software is configured to do that. Once it's live and that the curation team defines when something's published and when it's visible in the catalog, there's the expectation that it is going to be maintained. If there's major cybersecurity vulnerabilities that are associated with that there's a reasonable amount of time and grace given to either correct those things or somehow to mitigate them. So if something has been live for 3 years and it hasn't seen any major updates, the curation team has a report which they can look at and they can see that this has aged considerably. I think we need to go back and check to see if this is it even relevant? Is it working? And it may need to be pulled. Similarly, there's cases even with active implementation guides where a new company comes along in a new funding cycle. And this DaVinci had this happen to him as well. And the new development team said, well, this existing work is great, but this specific component, we're actually going to rewrite this in a new version. We've changed the architecture a little bit, so you can actually decommission this old version. We're going to put up a new one instead, and then connect that into the other moving pieces. So delisting and depublication is a part of the product lifecycle as well. That's expected to happen someday because nothing lives forever. All right. So back to Dr. Grando's case here. I'm going to switch to the live demo portion of this in a minute, and then I'm going to start to wrap up. So if you'd like to follow at home, you can search for shares in Foundry today. You can take a look at the various configuration settings for each of the constituent products that are part of that. I think there's actually like 7 or something like that. It's on a small number. And we're going to go through the same steps to see all of those constituent parts that are being listed here and running. So to demo that, I'm going to reset my environment here, click catalog, search for my shares full solution stack. I'm going to take a look at the links here if I wanted. And in her case, it's an academic project, and so there's probably some PubMed, etc. Yeah, so there's some PubMed links, other literature links. If you're interested in support and getting further details, she has a website set up that support links goes to. The support link is almost always going to be present for open source projects. That's probably going to go to the issues tab of their GitHub page. Feedback itself is always going to go through Foundry first before it goes to the developer, assuming that the developer is still around to respond to that. So for shares, I'm going to look at my default configuration. I'm not going to worry about any of the technical details, but I'm going to click over to bundled products here to take a look at everything that comes with it. What this isn't going to show, so this is just things that are directly bundled with shares. But remember from our previous slide that HAPI is also bundles a database with it. So Foundry is going to take care now of looking at each of these when they get bundled and then going into each of those recursively, taking care of any dependencies and then wiring those in as well. So we're not just going to get things at that first level of our dependency tree. We're going to get everything that we need. I'm going to add this configuration here. Click view. I'm going to trash my old file so it doesn't get confused. I'm going to click my download button again. All right. I'm going to run this, and it's going to go through the same process, and it's just in a much more complicated fashion now, where it's downloading those 7 or so pieces of software. It's booting them up, and I'm actually going to give this one a second to start because I want to show the way this looks when it's actually running locally. And HAPI does take a minute to start up, so I'm going to give that a little time. But while that's booting, I'm going to click to my shares full stack product here, which is actually what I was trying to run. And in these instructions, it's giving me some links to where to actually start in the user interfaces. Foundry has a concept which is a little bit new within the past couple months of what's called a stack controller. We've noticed that. I guess unsurprisingly, that when you're distributing software, 90% of the time, you're going to want to seed that with some set of FHIR resources, and especially the RIs, because RIs are kind of useless if it's just the software and doesn't also come with some sort of bundle of resources to go through the use case, because that's how you need to test things. And if you're Touchstone, like, you need to have test data in the system to be able to test it in the first place. And so what the stack controller does is it allows every publisher a very easy vehicle to seed via FHIR those data into whatever FHIR resource server is getting bundled with their RI. So this product itself is very generic, and the publisher has configured it with a single configuration file and some FHIR bundles with however many that is, pieces of data. I'm going to click this button here as specified in the instructions, and now it's loading. Looks like it's working in all cases. So it's loaded all my organizations, practitioners, and patient bundles into the system. I'm going to go to my instructions here. And now when I start clicking on the different user interface applications, I'm just going to open these all in separate tabs here. I'm going to be able to use them all in the pre-wired, going to use them all. There we go. So now I have patients showing up in my patient portal. I have my consent documents, hopefully showing up in my provider portal. I have my rules application that's showing the rules file, all pre-integrated together. And as a developer, I didn't need to look at the readmes first. I started by running it, and now I can go back, now that I have everything running, and go through the demos on my own machine. If I want to post additional FHIR resources to my machine or put them in my own cloud environment, it's so much easier now for me to do that. And then I can always go back to Foundry as well, and then search, go investigate all these other links. And if there was an IG, there would be an implementation guide button here where you could click that, and now I can go through the IG use cases in my own environment and modify that as necessary. So we're coming up on the close here. I'm going to jump back to the slides. Now, I did say there were 5 personas that use Foundry. The last one is curators, and this one is not really applicable, I think, to the majority of the audience. So I'm really going to not talk about that, except to say that there is an entire backend of Foundry that you will not see when you log into it, that the curators use to get reports on what's in the system to be able to maintain everything dynamically. And so there's a tremendous amount that's configurable within Foundry. And the more powerful aspects have to do with the way that things are bundled together, and so they can auto-wire, like I just demoed. But other than that, I'm not going to go into it since it's kind of a different audience. So let's start with some questions. If you have questions, if you could put those into the Q&A window within Zoom, I'll do my best. Excuse me, I'll do my best to answer them. All right, so Chris Taylor had been asking, by design, FHIR's goal is to reliably enable 80% of the industry use cases by their 80-20 rule. Anticipate most implementation issues will exist in the remaining 20% of the industry use cases. Would it be in scope for Foundry offer model code for some use cases outside of the core 80%? Absolutely, yeah, definitely. And I'm foreseeing a lot of, maybe at least in the US, like a lot of state specific, and then a lot of like region specific solutions start to show up. And we've kind of put some forethought as well into the way those will actually be organized. We do have a US world region here, since that's where we're initially rolling out, but we would absolutely love to start including some of the Latin American efforts and European efforts as well. There's a few things I thought that Europe had contributed so far. They may not be published yet, but would love to have that in there for that additional 20%. Yeah, absolutely. And that applies not just to software as well, but we're starting to kind of organize things to provide data bundles, as well as like CQL type scripts and other things that are computable, not necessarily directly runnable. Aspect 2, if it is in scope, would Foundry enable the community to filter projects to find US models that implement FHIR 5 in US CDI, or African models where projects are built around EHRs, and organize medical information by family unit and not individual patients? All right, so the first part of that, on the version of FHIR, there is a capability that's not enabled yet to be able to organize and sort things by the technical interface that the product supports. The definition of interface is a little bit abstract. It could be something as broad as FHIR R4, R5, It could be something as specific as an implementation guide or even a specific profile. So we haven't decided yet how to actually best implement those because we don't want to overload. We don't want to make it too difficult to be able to search for things as well as to curate things. Because if we go down to the implementation guide level, it may get a little onerous for the curation team to try to like track everything. It's very difficult to kind of do that, I think, as it is. I would say the answer is yeah, definitely we're continuously refining the way we're trying to organize things. And we're also trying to set ourselves up for success, 3+ years from now when we have an explosion on the number of things that are here and we need to be able to sustainably keep things organized. For models themselves, now this is not replacing the registry or things like Simplifier. So it's not trying to be a repository for profiles per se, nor is it trying to be a repository for IGs. It's really focused on runnable software, first reference implementations, and supporting infrastructure that is necessary to run those things. There are a number of invisible products that show up. One of those is telemetry. I did not demo this for the sake of time. If you wanted to actually like visibly see on the screen the way that data were flowing between one of those UI portals and the CDX service, hooks service, and the FHIR server, you can actually see like almost UML sequence diagram. They're not sequence diagrams, but kind of like that diagrams of the way data are flowing across those running services using something called telemetry traces, which is also it's based on a specification called OpenTelemetry in the industry that is not in HL7. So Foundry does support that, and we're encouraging developers to start using telemetry. And so as a developer, when you have these complex use cases, you also have a UI to see your payloads as they're going across the services. Looking ahead here, did not find Docker Compose for start serve. If you click that button here, I'm sorry, under my environments, it says Docker stack. Technically, it's a Docker Compose file. Here, that will download the file. Other things like I think CDEX, if you are experimenting with telemetry, for some products, there will be an additional area here of additional configuration files that are referenced by that Compose file. If that doesn't show up, it means there aren't any. But if you do end up with a Compose that has, it needs to reference a file to bind mount, and the file itself will be provided here. I see that titles and Foundry webpage typically contain project metadata, including hyperlinks to GitHub. You can contribute or share the code through other kinds of repositories such as GitLab, Bitbucket, etc. Absolutely. The reason that they're all currently in GitHub is because of an HL7 policy that there are HL7 orgs named HL7-DaVinci and HL7-FHIR, and the accelerators require that those projects are in those GitHub orgs. But again, that's just a policy. There's nothing that is within Foundry that's preventing us from linking to Bitbucket or GitLab or whatever. So yeah, please feel free to submit things to those. Just be mindful that if it is an accelerator policy, the curation team will insist that we clone or move your repo to that governance. What is the role of CDS hooks in this architecture? Is there a CDS server knowledge base to respond to requests? In this specific example that I ran, the function of the CDX service is purely request response. It's being provided with a patient bundle, an R5 patient bundle, as well as R5 consent resources, and applying security labels onto individual resources in the patient bundle based on some rules file. So that has a whole hour-long demo associated with it as well. All right, so we've got about 5 minutes left, and so I think it's a good place to kind of wrap it up, unless people have other questions. Sandy and Melinda, were there any other closing remarks? First of all, is just Foundry itself. That's fine. The support mechanism we're using for this is HL7 Zulip, and so for technical issues, and especially if we're participating in a FHIR accelerator program, the place for support in that is if you download the slides, that is this link right here. And all that is, if you are in FHIR Zulip, it's the Foundry channel. So feel free to ask us questions there. And especially on any of the other like tutorials or anything that we mentioned, I'd be happy to provide links.
Thanks for watching. If you found this helpful, give us a like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you won't miss the next one.